Okay, so I'm going to read out a little blurb that you have on your website.
All right.
Lumiere Press is the private press of Michael Torosian. In the fine press tradition, the books are composed in lead, hand-printed, and hand-bound. The publishing program is devoted exclusively to photography, and each book aspires in its concept, graphic design, and bookmaking craftsmanship to be the manifestation of its artistic content. The shop's first printing press was acquired in 1981, and in 1986, the publishing program was launched with the publication of Edward Weston, Dedicated to Simplicity, a book that I spoke with Michael about the first time that we got together to conduct an interview. Welcome again, Michael, to the Bibliophile.
Thank you very much.
Today we're going to talk about, among other things, bookmaking, photography, and interviewing in this conversation. The new book that you have published called Lumiere Press, Printer Savant and Other Stories. Perhaps you could tell me a bit about it.
The book really is to commemorate the establishment of the Lumiere Press Archives at the Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library. A couple years ago, they mounted an exhibition. The exhibition was not only specimens of every book I've published since 1986, but also artifacts from the archive. Photography was the core of my interest, but I didn't want to just take pictures all the time. I wanted to be an art historian in the field of photography. I wanted to be a book designer. I wanted to be a photographer. And so being a publisher enabled me to cover all the bases. When I was young, I came to an appreciation of this concept of self-actualization, of exploration, relentless exploration. And then I also say in the introduction to the book that this was married with a harmonious concept of general aesthetics. And basically general aesthetics is that everything is interconnected.
Yeah.
That really just pursuing one discipline is really a dead end. If you're a painter or you're a sculptor or you're a photographer, if that's your entire world, then you've got tunnel vision. It's far too limited. You've got to understand how everything integrates and intersects with everything else in the world, how cinema and choreography or cosmetology and literature, everything really nourishes and feeds everything else. So fortunately, at a relatively young age, I was able to grasp some very basic ideas that gave me a springboard to move forward. And as I said in the book, the names for these things are not really that important. I just like the nomenclature. It really has to do with these ideas were embedded in me somehow.
I just want to quote you on this particular topic on page 129. This experience alerted me to a fundamental principle. A fixation on one medium will lead to tunnel vision and the tendency to make works like works you've seen. It's important to be steeped in your medium, but an understanding of idiosyncrasy and humanity, individuality and universality, tradition and innovation cannot be found in one inbred corner. The cinema of John Ford, the music of Claude Debussy, the writings of Mark Twain, the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, the paintings of Edward Manet, the hand-rendered books of Edward Gorey, the objets of Man Ray, these and 1,000 other chance and purposeful encounters have seeded my mind with ideas. That's lovely.
Thank you. I think I also mentioned George Balanchine
Mm-hmm.
and Isamu Noguchi and Henri Matisse. And,
Yeah.
the list goes on and on.
Right.
Also, Django Reinhardt.
Yeah.
So, the sources of inspiration are very extensive. I just stuck in a little précis of a few names.
You say that the artist's primary obligation then is to explore his full potential, to cultivate the aptitude. So understand your medium and then seed that understanding with whatever else you open yourself up to.
Yeah, this is reflective, obviously. This is not a dogmatic statement that I'm trying to start a movement or a religion and I want people to buy into this. It's just my own reflection of my own philosophy. I had to do all of these things. And I realized also at a relatively early age that if you could only communicate on one wavelength, then you were destined to speak to a very small group of people. And so I tried to cultivate my skill as a writer very early. I thought that was absolutely fundamental.
How'd you do that?
I just decided to get published. I phoned up a magazine. I can barely remember what it might have been. I think it might have been something like a Financial Times or something. And I said, "Have you seen the auction results lately? Photography has become a thing." And this is in the 1970s when the market was just starting to bloom for photography. And they said, "No, we weren't aware of that." And I said, "Well, I can write an article." So I wrote this very nuts and bolts little thing. I don't think it was more than 75 words, but they published it.
Mm.
And I thought, well, that was interesting.
How does that cultivate you as a writer, though?
Because it puts your feet to the fire. If you write something and you just look at it or show it to a friend, you're not really testing it in the crucible of the real world. But if somebody's going to pay you and they're going to essentially endorse it as being worthy of their mainstream publication.
Mm-hmm. And edit it too, I would assume. Not in that case, but
sometimes.
Although I imagine you don't like being edited.
Not particularly, but after that I wrote a piece for Toronto Life, and after that I wrote a couple things for the Globe and Mail. And I just found that it demanded that I be very rigorous in what I was doing and try to do my absolute best. So I just learned by doing.
Okay.
And putting my material in the marketplace.
Well, the other thing too is your name's on it, so
yeah,
that's an incentive to make it as good as it can be.
Right. One does not want to embarrass oneself unnecessarily. This is true.
Were you proselytizing for photography from day one? Then was that like the focus of most of your writing?
Not really.
You're producing your books. And they're focused on photography. So it's partly self-interest.
It's really simply because this was the medium that I responded to most in my youth.
Okay.
And I really can't account for that, except, as I said in the book, my father came home from the library one evening and he brought me two books, one on Edward Weston and one on Aaron Siskind. And it really set my brain on fire. It was incredibly exciting. Maybe if I had been introduced to something else, it would have sent me in a different direction, a different path. I'm not really sure what captivated me so much in photography when I was a kid. But I liked taking pictures, and I had a darkroom by the time I was 13. So obviously, the whole business of developing film and making prints appealed to me a lot.
Yeah, the way you put it is that you lived with these photographs of Siskind and Weston. You absorbed them, and then you say you decoded the visual language. So how did you do that?
First of all, I assumed that if a photograph was in a book, somebody had decided it must be good. And if I looked at it and I found it interesting, but I didn't fully understand it, then there was obviously a chasm between the editor or the artist and me, and I had to find a way to transport myself over this chasm into a fully realized understanding of what this picture was about. And in many ways, I did this by examining the structure of photographs, the compositional language. To a great extent, people can look at a photograph and talk about light and shadow, about things, depth of field. There are all sorts of things you can discuss. But the entry point, in many cases, I have found, is composition that creates the actual visual phenomenon of this vista's extraction from reality. So, in response to your question, when I was a kid in my teens, I had a little cluster of books on my night table. I had a book that I really liked on W. Gene Smith. I had another one, I think, on Stieglitz. And I would study their work and try to figure out. I didn't have the language for it. I didn't understand things like counterpoint or juxtaposition. I had to sort of make up my own vocabulary for what was happening in the picture. But that's how I decoded it. And then later, when I started to learn words like negative space and all these things, I was, oh, that's what I was seeing. That's what I had deduced from this picture. So little by little, I read art books and I educated myself on many aspects of art, architecture, and the plastic arts. And I came to an understanding of the language of photography and the language of the visual arts.
I'm not sure if I understand that language, to be honest. I must say, I have a kind of a negative view of most photographers. I think if anyone can do that. And when I look at it, I think, nah, a lot of them aren't being intellectual. They're not. They're just taking photographs and maybe they're processing it in a certain way. I don't know if they've got a message. I've had trouble appreciating photography, and I need someone, you would be good, to help me appreciate what's difficult and great about the works that you think are worth spending time with.
I think this question could be formulated over almost any kind of art. I'm sure we could sit down with somebody and they'd say, I just came back from a Picasso Brock Cubism show, and I have no idea what that was all about. Or they could say, I just went to see a show on Polyakov. Like, what is this geometric stuff? Or Jackson Pollock, or who knows who. And I think what it comes down to is visual literacy. This stuff shouldn't be accessible. You can't read a book if you can't understand the language. If your first language is Romanian and somebody gives you a book in English and they say, Huckleberry Finn is a great book. It's a work of tremendous humanity. And they, oh my God, it's in English. What am I going to do? There's an impediment right off the bat.
We have a translator to help us, though. Whereas in photography, what have we got?
Well, it still requires learning the visual language.
Yeah, I can appreciate things like negative space and juxtaposition and light, and I mean, I not that I'm an expert, but I have a level of understanding. I just want to know in what makes Weston's work better than 95% of the other people that were working at the same time.
I don't know if there's an answer to that question, quite frankly. I think the real issue is that the language of photography is problematic because the human brain has a tendency to see an image very literally. And in photography, you're offered a simulacrum of the real world. Now, when you look at a painting by Manet, even if it's realistically depicted, there's no moment during which you believe this to be reality. You know it's pigment on canvas.
And brilliant.
Yeah,
I can appreciate the talent.
yeah. With a photograph, people look at it as though it's an unmediated window on the real world, as though the picture took itself. But I think what you really have to consider, and I think this is the key, the first step to understanding photography, is that photography, the black and white print, for instance, which is my medium, is as much a printmaking medium as an etching or a lithograph or a woodcut.
Mm-hmm. This is where the art comes in?
Certainly, yes. I mean, you wouldn't look at a woodcut or a linoleum cut and say, yeah, this is real. You understand it as a printmaking medium. You understand it for its artifice and for its artistry. And the same leap of imagination has to be made to understand a photograph. You could look at a Weston nude and say, well, that must be an accurate depiction of that individual, that figure. But that's really only the tip of the iceberg. That's only the smallest aspect of it.
Well, in other words, it wasn't, you look at that and you think, oh, that's exactly what he saw. But it's not exactly what he saw. Is that right?
Well, in the book, I talk about making a photograph. Walking around in a park one day, and I saw a man lying on a bench, and I stopped, I took the picture, and then I went to walk away, and I realized I didn't have the picture, so I turned around, and I quickly lowered the axis of the camera, made sure I had the film plane to match the plane of my subject, and I took a second exposure. And what I say in the book is I turned a subject in the real world into a new object, a photograph. And so this is constantly the battle that goes on. One could argue that the battle's been lost today.
Yeah, well, that's what I'm thinking. It's just so damn easy for me to take 100 pictures of
Right.
one thing and pick the one that I think is the most artistic.
Right, but for most of the 20th century, the photographers that I admire were working in a milieu where they had to have rather specialized skills to do what they did. Now that's gone today. Anybody can take a picture.
And what were those skills?
Well, I mean, first of all, somebody like Edward Weston, Edward Weston predominantly worked with an 8x10 view camera, which produced a sheet of film that was 8x10 inches, and it took enormous skill to operate that kind of camera and to make the kind of luxurious prints that he made. That was not something within the skill set of an amateur. Anybody with an iPhone 14 now can make a picture.
Which is weird, isn't it? It's like it took so much, brilliance and rare talent back then to do something now that anyone can do? That's odd.
It's one aspect, it's one facet of making the pictures that all I'm saying is it simply kept the population of serious photographers down. Photography couldn't proliferate in any kind of artistic way the way it had. I wouldn't say the art of photography has proliferated now. It's sort of been decimated by its own numbers. The books I've made and the area of photography that has always interested me is the photography of the 20th century. It's akin to somebody who is a conductor or a scholar of music, and they say, well, my period is late 19th century up to the, let's say, the debut of atonalism, and I have an area that I particularly appreciate, that I'm knowledgeable about, that I find most gratifying. Well, the area that I find most gratifying is 20th century photography. So, I haven't done a book on a 19th century photographer.
Yeah.
And photography as it exists today has metamorphosed into quite a different animal from the kinds of photography that I've explored in my books.
You know what I think I'm talking about is respect. I don't know that I respect these people enough. And you clearly revere, or you want to pay homage in the series that you have, but you deeply respect these people. I want to know why.
Well, because they're phenomenal artists.
Right.
I think that by any stretch of the imagination, Aaron Siskind is one of the most important artists of his period. Certainly, he was included in the Ninth Street Show, which is really the birth of abstract expressionism.
That was 51, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay.
And Aaron Siskind was included in that. And in many ways, his work preceded a lot of the defining aspects and movements of abstract expressionism. So he was very influential, very innovative. So, I don't think there's no mystery to me. I mean, these are very great artists. And, you can detect in the chapters when you read something like the chapter on Gordon Parks. This is a man of profound talent, humanity, sensitivity. He was everything you could hope for. So of course I was struck by him. He fascinated me. I was captivated by his work from the time I saw it in Life magazine when I was a kid. So there's no mystery to me as to the subjects I've chosen and the projects I've done. Now, as far as your dilemma, I can't do anything about that. You're stuck. You're stuck. But I have no ambivalence about.
No, clearly you've invested, and again, this is all. This is for me is a call to action. Someone as thoughtful as you are, someone who is as disciplined and dedicated to this field, and having that level of respect, it's clearly something that I need to learn more about to educate myself into appreciating it more. What you talk about in the book is learning, and your whole career has been learning things, and then.
Well, I think that's sort of the key to existence. Perhaps some people are blasé. They figure that their education ended the last time they walked out of a school building or something. But I felt quite the opposite. I felt that the day I had my last class in post-secondary school, I felt that now the responsibility was on me to learn independently. There was no curriculum, there were no teachers. It was my job to learn. I felt that was a basic requirement to be a human being and a basic obligation to be a human being. I don't really think that anybody had to tell me this or I had to discover it. It was just embedded in my psyche.
And you were motivated to understand the things that you liked, that you had an affinity for.
I think things develop very slowly over time, every once in a while you do have some kind of significant revelation, an encounter with a work of art or a book or an individual that opens a door for you. But otherwise, it's a slow process of every week encountering something new, every month, every year. And so this book really is the product of having lived to be 70 years old. And as I said, having been around the block a couple times. And of course, I think I've covered 22 books in this volume. So 22 books. To do a book, you actually have to become an expert on that artist. So it's like doing 22 master's theses with the occasional PhD dissertation thrown in.
You are smart, I'll give you that. As I was saying just before our conversation, it's hard to explain exactly the feeling you get when you're reading your material. It's like a workout. It's like liking the way it's written and liking what it says. You definitely polished it like crazy.
Yeah, I think the whole trick is when in writing is to try to make every word count. It's as simple as that. No filler, no boilerplate stuff, no reiteration of something you've heard. Everything should be original. I have things to say, and then you have to find a way of saying it. There's no puffery. There's no meaningless digressions. I've tried to make every single word count.
You know who it reminds me of? J.M. Coetzee, an author I love. And that's exactly how he's described. He's also a Nobel Prize winner.
All right. Well.
But anyway, enough.
If the committee in Sweden can hear this interview, I'll appreciate it.
That's right. Okay, so you did talk about a bit about respect. I don't want to leave that. Mm-hmm. Respect, you talk about the artist respecting themselves, respecting the work that they've done, and making sure that everyone respect.
You're quoting. Yes, you're quoting from the chapter on Michel Lambert. Yes, his 3 pieces of advice.
Right. This was very good, I thought. It was just about self-respect.
Yeah, I mean, Michel gave me 3 pieces of advice.
Yeah.
1, always put your best foot forward. 2, never give away your art. 3, do something every day. And what he meant by that was respect yourself, command respect for your work, conduct yourself with discipline and dedication. That is very concise, and I don't think anybody could come up with a better capsule philosophy of being an artist.
It's also confidence. If you want your work to command respect, that is confidence in your own work.
Perhaps, I guess, yeah.
Not arrogance.
No, not at all. I don't think it betrays any ego at all. It's a matter of belief, conviction.
Yeah, that what I've done is valuable. I mean, that's what you've done with this book. This is showing the value of what you've done, is it?
I suppose that's the embedded part of it. I didn't think of it that way. I simply wanted to explore how I got from pillar to post, making book after book, putting in some of the insights about the actual making of the book, the graphic design, but also talking about every aspect of the book, from how to conduct an interview to the sequential arrangements of pictures to the selection of typefaces, and how the idea of general aesthetics and embracing things outside the hermetic world of the book allows you to come up with new ideas. So every chapter really deals with a different aspect of creativity and publishing, bookmaking, photography. I've tried not to leave any stone unturned, all within 168 pages. I could have written a lot more on some of my projects, that's for sure. But I gave myself about 1,500 words a book. Otherwise, this would have swollen into an unwieldy project.
Well, it's concise and it does pack a punch, I think.
Well, it's amazing, you can actually say quite a bit about revealing an artist's point of view and the meaning of their work through your encounter with them.
Yeah,
Really.
you've met your heroes, and what they're all wearing clothes.
Yeah, I mean it's really quite remarkable. I remember when I was a student, there was a saying, I don't know who said it at the time, but that 75% of the photographers in Beaumont Newhall's book, A History of Photography, were still alive. That's how young the medium was. So it was possible for me to meet some of the greatest photographers of the 20th century. It was this incredible magical period in history, and I hit the wave at the right moment. And of course, these people were gracious enough to welcome me. Nobody ever questioned the sincerity of my motives or my dedication to what I was doing. I think they could somehow sense how meaningful this was to me.
Mm-hmm.
So, I had really quite extraordinary experiences. I went to Arizona to meet Frederick Summer. Of course, I went to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, to stay in the home of Aaron Siskind, which was wonderful. And, I had wonderful visits with Gordon Parks in New York City at his apartment in United Nations Plaza. So, it wasn't like, going to a gallery opening and meeting a famous artist for 5 minutes and having him sign a book. These were opportunities to spend extended periods of time with these artists. So it was very enriching.
Yeah, I really do. Given what I do, of course, I love what you had to say about, and I do want to get into that at some point further on in our conversation. The importance of interviewing as a primary interviews as a primary source, and as a literary form.
Well, I think I was alerted to this from several different points of view. First of all, I can't remember exactly what year. It was in the 1970s. I went into Old Favorites bookstore down on Queen Street, and I saw a couple anthologies of interviews from the Paris Review. They were all called Writers at Work, and I think I picked up 3 volumes that day, and then I subsequently got a couple more volumes. But they were, as I said, anthologies of the interviews that had been done over the years at the Paris Review. And so they interviewed playwrights, novelists, poets. It was really something.
They had a series which I have on publishers. They interviewed publishers about publishing.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I don't, as I said, this is the 1970s, so this is probably about 45 years ago, and I haven't looked at the books in a while. But I enjoyed them immensely. I found it riveting, and I really admired their devotion to capturing the voice of the artist. And I thought that was very admirable, and that's what I wanted to do. But I also, around the same time, I was looking at a exhibition catalog of a contemporary artist, a contemporary Canadian artist. And I read the essay in the book, and the author of the book had quoted from magazine articles and some newspaper reviews of this particular artist's work and speculated about their motives and their approach and things like this. And I thought, why did you go to magazine articles and newspaper articles and then speculate when you could have picked up the phone? This person is like 40 years old and lives downtown. And I've never been able to understand this inclination that some scholars have for not dealing with the artists themselves. And then when I encountered writers at work, it was a revelation. I said, it seems self evident to me this is the only way to do it, the only way to get the authentic information, undiluted, unpolluted by other people's perspectives. And
even if you are being spun, it's being spun by them.
well, I think I was lucky in a lot of ways that some of the photographers I encountered had not been extensively interviewed. They undoubtedly have been interviewed in the past, but great photographers of the second half of the 20th century were not on book tour circuits. There was nothing like that. So, I had the opportunity to probe their minds in a way that perhaps was refreshing, and I found them candid. I certainly, when I went to talk to Paul Caponegro in Cushing, Maine, we sat down in the morning after breakfast, and once we got going, it just like I opened the floodgates. I don't know how many tens of thousands of words I ended up transcribing, but he was an enormously rich source of anecdote, perspective, philosophy. It was really an incredible experience. So, yes, I do believe that the interview is an enormously important source material and, as I said, a literary component in its own right.
Yeah, and as you say, it involves a certain amount of editing that you may or may not want to inflict on it to turn it from a dialogue into a monologue, for example.
Yeah, I'm very candid about that. That these are edited interviews.
Yeah.
I don't want to pretend that somehow this just was an exchange between two people that came out flawlessly. They are very carefully edited, but I also make the point that I am scrupulous in preserving the voice of the artist. I never do anything that would skew the intention, and over all these decades, no photographer, no subject I've ever interviewed has ever contested even one word that I've published. So I've been very careful about that.
Okay, let's get back to the connection between the book and and photography. I do look forward to revisiting this piece about interviewing because you have a very valuable list of tenets or advice on how to proceed with an interview. But the connection between photography and the book goes right back to one of the inventors, you say, William Henry Fox Talbot. The first impulse was to make a book, you say. The book is the work of art. What do you mean by that?
Well, I just use the example that right out of the gate, as soon as photography in the printmaking form, photography was invented in two forms initially. The daguerreotype, which was a silver-coated copper plate, and Talbot's method, which was a silver-coated piece of paper. So obviously you can't take a copper plate and put it in a book. But the paper prints, that was the very first thing he did with them. He made the book The Pencil of Nature. And from there, photography was off and running, and original albumen prints were used in albums that were published. And, when it got to the point where mechanical means of reproducing photographs were available, then there was an explosion of publishing.
When was that specifically?
Well, I cite the case of Edward Curtis's The North American Indian, which was done over a period of several years in the early part of the 20th century. And those are all photogravures. And I make the point with that the photogravures were not a facsimile of something. They were the actual printmaking medium. So today we know Curtis's work primarily through the photogravures. They're not surrogates for like gelled and silver prints or something. They are what they are. And because they're in the book becomes the work of art in its entirety.
You say that the book is the medium of photography.
Yes, I believe that.
And that the language of picture selection and sequential arrangement is a form of artistic expression.
Yes. It's something that evolved. And I think part of it is that at the beginning of the 20th century, if you took a photograph with a 4x5 view camera, for instance, you ended up with a contact print that was 4x5 inches. Now, if you put this on a gallery wall, it really wouldn't command the gallery space. If you walked in the door and the opposing wall was 25 feet away, it would look like a little speck. And for so much of the beginnings of photography, the print was defined by the negative size. Enlarging was not readily available at first. Edward Steichen, to make his monumental prints of the Flatiron Building, for instance, he had to go through, exorbitant effort and devise his own way of making these multiple internegatives to actually achieve that kind of scale of printmaking. So what we have is a medium that is usually confined to 4x5, 8x10, 11, 14 inches. It's a medium that is scaled down to start with. And this actually makes it highly readable in a book because you're not taking a Velázquez that is 9 feet high and reducing it to a 3-inch image. You're taking something that's already been conceptualized at that size and you're reproducing it. So there's no loss in translation. So that's one of the many things that makes photography suitable for books is the scale. But also there's the fact that a black and white image, which is the preponderance of photographs made in the 20th century, could be reproduced by photogravure or, well, I can't think right off the top of my head, obviously halftones and duotones, offset lithography. But there were a number of photomechanical processes in those days. I'm trying to remember. There's one that a company in New England did.
Oh, yeah.
What was
Meriden,
it?
was it?
No, there was another company, Calotypes.
Oh, okay.
That's what it was, Calotypes. Okay. I have a book of calotypes in the house, and they're very beautiful. There were a whole array of ways to get from A to B, and you could make a credible reproduction of a black and white print that preserved the object quality of the original. You can't say that if you had a Gauguin painting and you made a reproduction of a book that it preserves the object quality. No, what you've got is a reference to the original painting. Yeah. Whereas in photography, it is possible to preserve that object quality. So the combination of scale, object quality, and then the opportunity to make a statement through the sequential arrangement of the images and the scaling and the graphic design of the book, I think more and more it became self-evident. This is not an original idea of mine by any stretch of the imagination. I think a lot of people concur with me that the book is the medium of photography, that not necessarily exhibitions, but the book itself. That's what has disseminated the language of photography. The book is something that has given credibility to the full exploration of the artist's approach and thinking and philosophy.
It's the end goal for many, many photographers.
Not only that, up until very recently, and I'm not even sure if I can make a case that it's changed that much, but for many years, photography was rarely shown in art galleries.
Mm.
I think if you made a list of art galleries in North America, you would see that places like the Museum of Modern Art instituted a photography department and a photography program as early as the 1940s. But if you went down the list, you might find that, Boston received work from Alfred Stieglitz and they had shows, and there were other places. But you'd be hard pressed to make a robust list of museums that were showing photography all the time.
Or galleries, right? I mean, that's
true.
That's one of the books that you've made.
He was on the Witkin Gallery.
Exactly, and the fact that he was responsible for promoting and normalizing photography as a work of art, right?
And that's amazing because there had been a couple photography galleries in New York, but Witkin really was the first commercial gallery that was financially viable and actually was able to create a collector market for photography.
Yeah, what was the trick? What did he do?
I think it was the time period. Photography had been, when I was young, every single article on photography in the general press would start off as photography and art form. And somebody would...
no respect, right?
Yeah, somebody would torment themselves trying to come up with an answer to this. And then finally, at a certain point, it stopped being a topic of conversation. It became self-evident. Somebody would go to a show and see a riveting body of work by Robert Frank or something, and they wouldn't ask anymore whether it was art. They would just accept it. Right. So Witkin came along just at the right point.
Well, like you did. Is this what you're saying?
Yeah. When there was a coterie of people who embraced photography as an art form, they didn't have to be cajoled. They didn't have to be convinced. They didn't have to be...
Like I did, you mean?
Right. They didn't have to be converted. They didn't have to be proselytized. And I'm sure that he had a couple big hills to climb with some of his clients. But the fact is, the timing was right. There was a wave at which photography was no longer consigned to being the subject of debate. Now in the 21st century, there are big festivals, big art fairs of photography. The prints go for serious money at auctions. So nobody really has that debate anymore, mercifully.
I'm trying to have that debate, but it's. Why did you want to pay homage to these artists who shaped your perception of modernism?
Well, your question, the answer is embedded right in that they shaped my perception.
You're grateful for them having taught you something?
Yes, I wanted to pay tribute to the artists that I admired and revered.
Why?
I think it's the idea, we talked about this once before, and I can't cite the source, but the idea that seeking the greatest minds of your time, that kind of directive, that kind of exhortation.
Matthew Arnold, I think that's who.
Yeah, but that kind of exhortation is actually tremendously profound. It's a wonderful idea that if you have intellectual curiosity, go to the greatest minds of your time. and have that kind of exchange, have that kind of nourishing encounter.
It's going to the canon. These are members of the photographic. Then there's a squabble over who belongs to the canon, of course.
Well, these are highly personal projects. If I worked for a big museum somewhere, then you could make the argument that I have a public responsibility and they have to adhere to a certain program. But this is me making books. I can do whatever I want. So I have the privilege of picking the artists I want, and I don't have to do anything like somebody coming along and saying, "Well, you should do so and so because they are hot, and you'll sell 1 million books."
Mm.
I don't work that way. The books are limited edition books. There's a finite number of copies. There's no necessity or imperative to think about picking a subject based on its saleability. I do what I want. Now, as to the canon issue, that's partially true, but not really. I didn't want to paint myself into a corner and exclude potential subjects because they didn't adhere to a predetermined checklist in my mind. So I've done books on my contemporaries like Edward Bertinsky and Raphael Goldchain and Timothy Greenfield Sanders, because the projects were introduced to me or dropped in my lap, and I thought they'd be marvelous books to do. I'm not dogmatic about it.
No, I was just going to say that I know that there's this human impulse to praise what you think is noble or profound or worthy. So, you could have done all sorts of different types of books, but you decided to pay tribute to these people. I just wonder why.
Well, as I said, in the case of Edward Weston and Aaron Siskind, I couldn't have imagined, let's say when I was 16 years old and I saw these books, the idea that a kid in rural Ontario with a darkroom in the garage would one day be visiting Aaron Siskind, his home in Pawtucket. This is not something that ever entered my mind. It was unfathomable.
It's almost dream coming true territory.
Yeah, but 20 some odd years later when it happened, it seemed inevitable. How I got from here to there is part of the story of the book. My determination. And it all comes out of a desire, as I say in the book, to be part of the dialogue of my medium.
Yeah.
That really informs everything I've done, whether it's writing or taking pictures or the publishing of books. I want to participate. I want to be part of the dialogue of my medium. And so that meant for me meeting these great artists and picking their brains, having conversations with them, exchanging ideas and learning. As I was writing the book, sometimes I can hardly believe some of the experiences I've had. Because there is so much work involved in doing these books, so many long 10, 12-hour days in the shop, 7 days a week.
Physical work.
Right? Oh, yeah. It gets to the point where sometimes my memory of a project is like, climbing up Everest half a dozen times with no oxygen. So this gave me an opportunity to filter out some of that and actually cherish the most meaningful aspects of each project without belaboring. I don't even go into the technical issues in the book, really. I allude to things like typecasting and printing and hand binding, but I don't get into with any depth into anything like that. That's a story for another time. How the books are made. That's really not germane to what the projects are about or what has propelled me through life. I enjoy this stuff a lot, but as I said, once the hard physical labor's behind me, I can actually really enjoy the experience of what I've gone through. It's unbelievable.
Well, pride. You must feel pride.
Yeah, I'm very proud of the work I've done in my life. I've tried not to squander my existence.
What does that mean? You worked
I,
your ass off?
well, I've never done anything that I didn't feel I should do. It's as simple as that. I haven't had a job of any description when I was very young, and I hadn't really found a way of making my way in the world of art. I'd have little jobs here or there, working on a construction site for a couple of weeks or in a warehouse for a month, things like that. But that was a long time ago. I
Mm.
haven't worked in any capacity for anybody else in well over 40 years. So the last 40 years of my life, maybe, I don't know, exact 42, 43 years of my life, all I've done is do what I do. Whether it's taking photographs, making books, writing. I think that's sort of the triumph of one's existence is trying to make every day meaningful, creative, and not distracted by something else.
Who is Bill Edwards?
Bill Edwards was the president of Light Impressions, which was a company that, in addition to selling archival supplies like mounting board and enclosures for pictures, he also had the biggest catalog of photography books back in the 70s and 80s. And he was the premier dealer in the United States for photography books. He really had a lock on the market. And so when I did my first book, it was like an obvious impulse to go and visit him and see if he was interested in distributing any of my books.
Yeah, what'd he say?
He looked at the Edward Weston book and said, I'll take as many as you can give me. And then he offered to pay more than the sticker price of the book. And I couldn't believe this. And he said, well, you just don't understand what you've made. I'm going to sell these for a lot more than you are selling them for. You just don't understand how special these books are. And he was right. I really didn't have a perspective. I'd gone to some fine press book fairs, but you know, the people who had participated in these, they were very good craftsmen, very good artisans, and in some cases incredibly ingenious graphic designers, but they didn't really have any perspective on publishing, and they were undervaluing their work. And so when I used that as a template, I too undervalued my work. So it took Bill to really wake me up and push me in the right direction. So that was very gracious of him. He could have just taken the books for what I wanted and then made a monster profit on them, but he was very fair to me.
Hmm.
And so then he told me he wanted, I can't remember, X number copies of every book I did after that, which really made it possible for me to publish a book and recover the cost of the materials on the day that I launched the book. So things like that really kick-started me.
That's such a wonderful connection to make and to have made.
This is the other thing too, is I had the whole territory to myself. Nobody was making handmade limited edition books on photography.
Yeah.
And in those days, this was pre-internet. So book dealers, there were specialty book dealers throughout the United States. They just loved this stuff. And at one point, I got a call from a dealer in Chicago, and he said, in our last conversation, you told me that you were going to do a book on Frederick Sommer, and I phoned up two of my colleagues, and we put together a little consortium of our three bookshops, and we'd like to buy 1/3 of your entire press run on day of issuance. And so things like this were happening because I was gaining traction and people were discovering that the books were selling out really fast. So it's a classic case of success breeds success.
I want to jump back to photography for a moment here. Can you explain quote, "The portrait is not the person, it is a photograph of the person."
I will try. I think that this is a fundamental philosophical point of view to understanding the photographic portrait. Oftentimes, people will look at a portrait and they will just assume that's the person. They will, I think, seduce themselves into believing that the photographer has captured one meaningful moment that reveals this individual's personality and character. I don't believe that. I think that that attitude really leads to cliches and stereotypes.
Well, it is when you consider what a human being is.
Yeah, exactly.
360 degrees.
Exactly. You know, a much truer exploration of a person was Alfred Stieglitz's serial portrait of George O'Keeffe. He took innumerable portraits of her, and it is a staggering body of work. He really explores picture after picture what a portrait is. As a curator once said to me, with every picture he asks a question and then he answers it. And as I probed this question, I wanted to answer for myself what a photographic portraiture was. And I started off with the premise that a photograph is not the person, it's a picture of the person. So what does this mean? It's a new reality. And I had to figure out how to create this new reality. And I needed some kind of basis for this. And I thought about it a lot and I investigated different ideas. And finally, I came across Stanislavski's book, An Actor Prepares. And what I discovered was an actress can only fully inhabit a role if she brings her own life experience to that role. So what you have on stage is a synthesis of a playwright's creation of a person and the actress's embodiment of that person. So it's the synthesis of these two converging consciousness. And as they like to say in method acting, it's living truthfully under imaginary circumstances.
So is that what you want your subject to do?
Well, I want to create a new reality. In a way, the subject is themselves, but they're playing a role for the camera.
Yeah, you don't want them to fake anything. You don't want them to give you a fake smile. You do want a truthful depiction of who they are, I suppose.
Right. But what Stanislavski gave me was an idea about how you find truth in artifice. You know, I was very emphatic that when I took a picture, I didn't want my subject, I didn't want to say, just pretend I'm not here. And when I see what I want, I'll click the shutter. No, I said, no, you've got to be conscious of the camera, but not self-conscious of it. Yeah. What we're doing is we're working together towards something. So as I said, it was living truthfully under imaginary circumstances, bringing authenticity to the photograph.
Yeah, I don't understand that. That sounds like bringing authenticity. Like that's one word that's so fucking overused these days. How do you do that?
Well, that's the trick. You have to read my book, Printer Savant. All the answers are in there. I mean, you know, either I have wisdom and genius or I don't. We gotta decide here. You know.
Okay.
We can't have it both ways.
Okay.
Now, I hope that you've brought up the whole issue about how somebody might respond to the book, what they might get out of it.
Yes,
and I can't say that I actually gave that a tremendous amount of thought, but as we've been sitting here talking, and I'm starting to think about it, I do hope that this book could serve as a roadmap for somebody to understand what it takes to be a publisher. Maybe specifically what it takes to be a publisher in an art form with attention to the structure and execution of the book rather than somebody who just sort of brokers a project. But I'd like to think this, with the diversity of ideas that I've examined, that this could be some kind of roadmap to an understanding of what bookmaking and publishing is all about. It is very hard work to make these books. I cite the case of making, I don't remember, 400 some odd gel and silver prints in the darkroom, an exorbitant amount of effort, making these prints one at a time under the enlarger, putting them through the chemistry by hand.
Right.
But I make the point that even though this is a tremendous amount of work, in many ways that is the whole point. I think that there is dignity to work.
But it's the body of work that I was intrigued by. It's.
Well, I was saying that as a turn of phrase.
No, I don't think you were.
Yeah, I was saying we're out in the shop, and I have it over there. But I have a little piece of paper that says "To work is to pray," the motto of the Benedictine order.
Yeah.
And I do believe that
this body of work, I don't know exactly where it is, but you speak eloquently about the significance of having a body of work.
Yeah, I think what it is it's the substantiation of all of this labor and effort. I think there's dignity to work.
Proof?
No, I think when you do something, whether it's gluing up a book or writing, whatever you're doing, you should do it with purpose and aspire to excellence. Nothing should be done just to get it off the workbench. I try to focus and put my best foot forward, make my best effort all the time. I try to inhabit that as a way of being. And I really believe that work is purposeful, that it is dignified.
Well, the right kind of work.
Well, everything I do...
Creative work. No, your work, not everyone's work.
Well, I can't speak for anybody else. All I know is every day when I do something, I try to do my best and I feel rewarded by it. And so the cumulative body of work is sort of the physical evidence of all these decades of labor. I told you what had compelled me to save everything.
You did, but
I'll remind you.
Yeah, thank you.
It was Truman Capote. Back in the mid-'80s, the New York Public Library at 42nd and 5th Avenue had an exhibition of the papers of Truman Capote. He had died the year before and bequeathed his papers to the library. And they put together this beautiful exhibition. And I went to see it 3 times. I was absolutely mesmerized by it. In addition to having things like the original manuscript to In Cold Blood, which was written in pencil in a child's notebook. It was so incongruous. It was unbelievable. But there were train tickets, there were photographs, there was a scrapbook that one of the FBI agents' wives had kept and given it to him. The whole room was just replete with all of these artifacts, and it really allowed you to understand the creative journey of Capote over his lifetime. And at that moment, I decided to keep absolutely everything. And that's why in the book, when I say that I drove Aaron Siskind over to Vito's barbershop, it wasn't because I remembered it was called Vito's Barbershop. It's because I still had the business card, 25, 30 years later. Yeah. I'd kept everything. So because of seeing this exhibition on Truman Capote, I decided I could never have anticipated that the esteemed Thomas Fisher Rare Book Library would house the Lumiere Press Archives. But I certainly made it my pledge to save everything because, again, I sort of felt that that's what an artist does. An artist pursues self-actualization an artist sees things from the point of view of general aesthetics, and an artist keeps everything. I just saw an exhibition in Paris at the Musée Picasso, and they showed like a little jar of Picasso's fingernail clippings
Jesus.
and
Yes.
and his hair. He kept everything. There are none of my fingernail clippings in the Lumiere Press Archives, but it is a robust archive. There's a lot of material in there, including probably 150 hours of interviews
Yes.
that I've conducted.
Yes, and we do need to get to that. That's about a page away.
Okay.
And it's interesting. One of your approaches to interviewing, and it's similar to mine, but maybe not. I mean, if I'm working off a book like I am today, I will write down quotes and passages that I might not understand or might debate. I do want to bring those into the conversation, and so that's why I'll write it down, as opposed to your writing down a list of all the questions and then discarding it so that you can focus on exactly what's being said and listen. But let me just sort of work through, if it isn't interrupting the flow of the conversation too much. This was my artistic declaration that the portrait only becomes a work of art if the reconciliation of persona and spirit is understood within the language of its execution. Can you just add a bit to that?
Yeah, what I was specifically talking about was the printmaking. That a certain approach to printmaking helped to actually take the image away from the literalness that is often undermines an image. And, I took these photographs and I bleached them, I toned them, and all of this was part of creating this new reality, which I felt that Hans Holbein did also. I mean, he was working with pigments and colors. He was not making flesh and blood image. So it's all part of what all artists do.
I can easily understand that. That makes sense to me. The artistic talent and skill, intelligence required to work with a print and do these things and make the decisions, that definitely is artistic.
Well, this is the same list of requirements to do anything, whether it's designing the book or making the images. You still have to sort of work through the same transformative process. This is not some kind of self-evident, ready-made phenomenon. Every word has to be written down. Every image has to be sized and sequenced. So it's all of a piece.
Well, in fact, the word you use here, in my world order, I discovered there were more opportunities than impediments, and that life favors those who savor their work, enjoy their accomplishments, and shake off the background noise. It is astonishing how much success you can have if you just let yourself see it. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think it speaks for itself.
No, the very last piece. If you just let yourself see it. Doesn't someone else, sorry to interrupt, but doesn't someone else validate, or are you the validator of your own work?
In this particular instance, what I was talking about was I was looking at the larger art world. And at that particular moment, I think this is back in '88 or something, I saw a lot of what I perceived as impediments. And there was really no need for me to try to worry about the future and worry about these imagined impediments. It was a kind of futile exercise. Really just savor the wonderful things of that come with doing what I do. And then all of a sudden, once I changed my mind and had this perspective, I realized how successful I really was being.
You quote E.M. Forster, who says, I write, I'm paraphrasing here, to understand what I'm thinking.
Yeah, I think Forrester said, I write to find out what I have to say. And I think this is true of a lot of things. I quote in relationship to designing a book. I don't have some kind of pre-planned idea when I design a book. I let the content of the book inform what the book should be. And I find out what the book's going to look like, by designing it.
Kind of an adventure that you don't even know the conclusion to.
No. Particularly in the case that I cite of the Paul Caponegro book, of designing the cover in under 60 seconds. That it just happened mercifully.
We've got a little bit more to go, and then maybe we'll take a break, and we'll conclude with a section on interviewing, if that works for you.
Whatever you want to do.
Great. I love this little section. This is Fred Summer. You say when you go out to visit him in Arizona, you hand him one of your books. And then he looks at it, he examines it, and then he turns it over in his hands, and he says, if I was to be remembered by only one book, he said, I would want it to be as beautiful as this. That's pretty sweet.
It was a lovely moment, yeah. It was very nice of him. I've found that the photographers I've worked with have been very responsive to the books I've made. They've really appreciated them.
And when you think about it, if these people are, then you don't really care what anyone else thinks.
Yes, well, it's in philosophical, intellectual circles, it's what we like to call the frosting on the cake. The response to these books over the decades has been tremendously gratifying. To be able to find an audience, sustain an audience, and in many cases actually develop communication and a rapport with some of my collectors who have responded to the books the way you have,
Well, any bibliophile is going to respond the way I did, I would think. And anyone with any taste, anyway.
Well, there we go. Not everybody responds the same way. Not everybody is seduced by the object. You've got to learn that nothing you can say can convince somebody of the worth of something. Yeah. Either they intuitively understand the worth or they don't. You can't twist their arm or browbeat them into appreciating it. And that's not my inclination at any time. I could say, Man Ray is like one of my most famous artists of all time.
Favorite?
Oh, I meant to say one of my favorites.
Yeah.
But if somebody else said, Man Ray, I'm not really into him. Well, okay, that's the way it goes. There's not enough time on earth to try to go around convincing people to agree with you about this kind of stuff. People just have to find Lumiere Press and hear that there's a voice that speaks to them, that there's a visual experience that they find enriching and intriguing. But I don't really know that you can't cajole somebody into that state of mind.
Here's Minor White, who says, see a photograph not for what it is, but for what else it is. And you then talk about the allegorical tableau.
Yeah, again, this is just reinforcing throughout the book the admonition not to take things literally. Can you imagine if everybody who read a novel or a poem or looked at a painting took everything literally? You would think that they were being rather juvenile about it. You would think they were sophisticated. I think the sophisticated mind looks at things and you have to bring a lot of yourself to the examination of a work of art. You can't go into a museum and somebody says, well, that Titian is an important painting. And you say, yeah, it's an important painting. Okay, next slide. If you don't invest something of yourself in it, you're not going to get anything out of it.
Well, bring your own associations to it. That's how your brain works, is through associations.
It's a lot of it. It's knowing something about the milieu of the artist, the medium, bringing your own life experience for sure, but also bringing your knowledge and associations of other
Yes, that's
artistic.
kind of what I meant. Yeah.
Yeah.
In all senses of that word.
Periodically throughout the book, I've reinforced that idea of escaping literalism. And so I took the opportunity with the Minor White quote, essentially just to underscore it one more time.
Yeah. Okay. I just want to wrap up part one here with, the fact that you have selected writers, paired them with different photographers, picking the right writer. That's what a good publisher does. In one case, you actually represented, you wanted to bring life to a friend and photographer's work to revive their career and actually get really involved in their career.
Oh, you're talking about Dave Heath?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's friendship as much as anything, isn't it?
Well, I don't know.
Maybe not.
It's hard to say. The backstory is that when I did the Michelle Lambeth book in the mid '80s, Dave phoned me up and said, "I'd like to take you out for supper. There's something I want to talk to you about." He said, "I'd like you to do for me what you did for Michelle. You studied his work. You cataloged it, you curated an exhibition, you wrote 2 books, and, nobody's done this on my work." And I said, I've just gotten off of like 9 years of devotion to Michelle's work, and I'd like, my other part of my life back. So I said, I can't do it. And this went on for 10 years of Dave periodically asking me.
Okay.
And finally, after 10 years of this, as I say in the book, he just said, all the photographers I knew from the old days have gone on to acclaim, and I've been forgotten. And I said to him, well, do you think you've been unfairly overlooked? Or do you think it's because of some self-destructive tendency? He said, oh, well, that's my dominant personality trait. And so at that point, I actually felt sorry for him. Mm. And I was largely motivated by admiration, authentic admiration for his work, but also sympathy.
Yeah.
And so I took on the job of managing his career, publishing 2 more books, setting him up with high-profile galleries, and creating a market for his work. So that was that.
It's just another aspect of the life of a publisher.
Well, I think that it was interesting because, as I said about the whole issue of self-actualization, I really believe that you should engage in everything. So in addition to writing and designing and photographing, I also felt that it was important to be a mentor. So I've had more than 45 assistants at Lumiere Press. I felt it was important to be an entrepreneur. So it was important to successfully market these books, but I was able to use the entrepreneurial muscle in creating a market for Dave Heath's work. So being in the arts really to me is doing everything, whether it's being an educator, being an entrepreneur, being a creative artist, everything in between. As long as it's enriching, as long as it's interesting, as long as it's demanding of the mind and talent, then nothing is really off the table.
Including interviewing, which is where we're going after a
Okay.
little break.
Okay. This means I can turn the heater on. I turn it off because it makes so much noise.